Okay, let's get going. Almost on time, which is tremendous. So thanks for taking a shorter break. Can I remind you that at the end of this session at 8 o'clock, we will be paying tribute to Boris Nemtsov. So please do stay here. That'll be for about half an hour before we adjourn for dinner. Well, thinking the unthinkable. What is next in store for us? Remember the conference title, The Limits to Order. Francois Heisberg had that sobering alert yesterday. It's not the 19th century, but it feels like a 19th century world. So what else is looming? Can we predict it, or do we just have to take it in our stride? And we need to think much broader than Russia, Ukraine, and the immediate direct neighborhood. Meeting here 2 years ago, there could be no mention of the probability of Ukraine rejecting the EU association agreement or the likely catastrophe in Ukraine, or of Russia seizing Crimea with its annexation. Then ISIL. What was ISIL? Taking Mosul in Iraq just about a year ago. Then Ebola breaking out in the way that it did on the scale that happened in West Africa. Médecins Sans Frontières said it's going to be a major problem. The World Health Organization said, no, it's going to be of only modest capacity. And then a 60% reduction suddenly in the value of a barrel of oil. And the corporate digital devastation caused to Sony by a massive hacking attack, probably by North Korea. Last year, no alert that Saudi Arabia would launch a significant military operation with warplanes and artillery into neighboring Yemen. And now the massive migration threat to Europe from North Africa that defied assessments of a year ago, with millions already waiting in the human pipeline somewhere in northern Africa. These are all unthinkables. And we all know how much surprise and shock they have created in the last 15 to 18 months. And for much of that time, leaderships and those who work for them have really been wrestling with these new realities. And governments and their public servants have become, at times, almost unhinged by the scale, the surprise and the shock of what was unfolding in ways that they had no preparation for. None of these were normative developments. And let me tell you, I'm doing a big research project at the moment on thinking the unthinkable, with a lot of one-to-one interviews with a lot of senior politicians, senior public servants, senior corporate executives in the C-suite. And many of them are confirming just how surprised and shocked they have been as they've tried to manage and handle what has been an overwhelming scale of so many issues on so many days for so many hours, and trying to handle them all in parallel. So really, it could be said that this title is not a gimmick for this conference. Unthinkable is really the new normative. Are you ready? Are you coping with it? How are you handling it? Let's hear some of you on the practical realities, if we can. Expose big problems of leadership culture. That's what we're seeing. Problems of conformity, of behavior, of being overwhelmed in private offices, whether in the corporate sector or in public service as well. The difficulties of groupthink predominating in many places. And let me tell you that I'm getting a lot of indications that a lot of career civil servants feel uncomfortable about warning about the unthinkables because they think it's even a career killer for them. Overwhelmed in this digital age of big data and transparency when we know more than ever. Or were unthinkables really unthinkable? As we've heard here this morning from Andrei Illarionov, everything Russia has done was largely signaled in one way or the other as long ago as 11 years back and even further, although I think Michael McFaul was not so convinced. But one German foundation did remember Putin warning about what he would do, he was in St. Petersburg then, in 1994, about Crimea. Now, I did say this was brainstorming because I'd like to hear your thoughts as well as the panel and their expertise and their insight from their positions of responsibility that they have. In essence, you're all an expert panel here. What are the unthinkables that you're thinking about, even if only stimulated by this session? And what needs to be on the agenda of leaders going forward from now, not next year or 10 years down the road, but next week and maybe a few days down the track? That's the speed in this new real-time environment. So there are plenty of unthinkables, particularly about ISIL, as we heard from Ahmed Rashid earlier, and the way the Muslim world and the Islamic world is thinking about things in a very different way. What can you put on the agenda? Your ideas, please. Anything will be gratefully received up here. But first, let me go to our panelists. They're not going to talk for very long because I want to come to you as soon as possible. The institutional realities and limitations of thinking unthinkables, and why this is such a big ongoing limit to some kind of order. The unthinkables, please, on your screen, and your capacity to deal with them. Lamberto.
Yeah, I would start with an example of, from the OSCE. A couple of years ago, we started in the OSCE a process of discussion with the participating states on future threats and challenges for the organization, so that to try to look ahead and see what the organization should prepare itself for. This discussion was led by the then chairmanship, which was Ukraine. We developed a number of papers. I went twice to Crimea for discussions around this theme during that year. Ukraine, Crimea, never featured on this paper. So this is an example of...
How long ago was that? How long ago was that? How long ago?
This was 2 years ago, 2013. And we ended up with a ministerial council in Kiev with Maidan running in the streets and ministers going more out on the streets than coming in the main room to discuss the issues, where we still had this debate on the future thing. So it's very often a matter also of ability to be able to read the signs. Ukraine now, we are saying, and also in the OSCE, as we've been dealing with what we call the protracted conflicts, and we see a thread that runs through we see commonalities and we see patterns also as they are developing now. But Ukraine is also where I would start in this discussion, because Ukraine is introducing now geopolitics on the agenda, and it's also complicating in certain ways the way we can work together to address common challenges for the future.
But do let me challenge you to think more broadly than Ukraine.
But I'm coming
because
there.
Your responsibility is Europe.
I'm coming there. And we are looking at, I would say, three perspectives. One is the intra-European and this, the Ukraine factor and the spheres of influence emerging, etc. And that in itself is a set of challenges. Second, as we are a regional organization, we look at our borders. The Mediterranean, Afghanistan, even Northeast Asia, the non-proliferation issues, etc. So we focus on the issues relating to each specific situation and try to identify those questions that are critical in terms of impact on the security of the organization. The third set of issues are the more global trends. From terrorism, for instance, and the impact of terrorism, to new phenomena beyond migration, and there's a lot of discussion on migration, the various aspects related to that, trafficking human beings, for instance, in the context of migration. Climate change is something that is developing fast. We have a process of internal brainstorming through what we call the security days. We will have one coming up soon that will be devoted to radicalization and dialogue to try to marginalize radicalism and to engage at various levels, international organizations, partner countries, Arab countries, etc. But then looking beyond that, we already have countries who say we need to focus more on climate change issues and the security aspect of that. And there's a whole list of questions that come up. We had one on water last year, and the issue of water and the impact of water on relations. So the problem that we are facing is that we start feeling overwhelmed by the breadth of the security challenges that are coming up. We're kind of prioritizing at this moment. For us, it's going back to the beginning, it's Ukraine, first of all, and we want to try to stabilize the situation there, and as a first step for us to be able also to make the organization more efficient, more effective, to address some of the other issues. But prioritizing is difficult because depending on where you sit, you see a different set of questions coming up. And therefore, the noise in the room becomes confusing in a way.
But let me press you on all four of you, though. Yeah. This business of unthinkables. the fact that things were not on the agenda and then they've happened, not just in a modest way, but in almost a seismic way. What are we discovering about a new trend, what many are beginning to call this departure from normative assumptions?
It's very difficult. I still think that there has to be a plan. You have to work at two levels. One, try to plan for whatever you think may happen. Cyber attacks, for instance, and we're working on cybersecurity and try to develop measures to address those issues whenever they come up. The other one is preparing yourself as flexibly as you can with a very broad toolbox to address whatever may surprise you. But of course, it is in the nature of the unthinkable to not being able to think about it
You've got it in
so
one.
you need to work on the tools.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Let me go to Riina, Kionka, who comes from Donald Tusk's office, who's Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to the Council President. What do you relate to this challenge of the unthinkables? You simply can't think about them. So what do you do about it?
Yes, it's a familiar thought, and in fact, when I read the topic of the title of our panel, I immediately thought of Herman Kahn and his seminal work on how to survive nuclear war, and I thought I had called Thinking the Unthinkable, and I thought I had by accident found myself on the wrong panel or agreed to the wrong panel and started thinking about the unthinkable career prospects that would be waiting for me back in Brussels after this, because the EU has nuclear security and nuclear safety policies, but nothing about war. So, but it's not about that. It's really what we're talking about is the inconceivable, and what could be inconceivable for the EU right now. Starting first of all in the neighborhood is the fact that, or the idea that the Ukraine crisis with its many aspects. It's not only just the crisis, the military situation that we're talking about. It's also the shortfall in the budget, which is very dramatic, and it will have implications further on as well. We're talking also about the reform agenda in Ukraine, which will have an effect on whether and to what degree the government is able to maintain some public support and stick with the agenda. So it has a number of different aspects, Ukraine. But if we look at the southern neighborhood, then, well, my boss called an extraordinary European Council this week because of the migration deaths at sea. We're talking not only about migration, but about counterterrorism. And the fact is, nobody has a plan B. And it's not clear everybody has a plan A either. There's a plan that was developed from the European Council, but it requires all kinds of legal underpinnings that we're not sure are going to happen. A UN Security Council resolution, or the creation, the establishment finally of a government in Libya that could ask for a potential operation to help interdict smugglers' boats. So this is a kind of unthinkable that's very much on the table right now. If we go further afield, then I think we need to think about China as well. Somebody yesterday, I think it was Anna Palacio, mentioned the question of the Bretton Woods system no longer responding to the balance of power and the configuration of power in the world. And we're seeing, as a result, China setting up all kinds of alternative fora. The 16+1 with some of the Eastern EU member states and some outside the EU is one of them. This new investment bank that they're setting up, the AIIB, which is being set up because of the question, the specific issue that Anna Palacio mentioned, which is that the IMF they're not finding it to be an adequate place for them, reflecting of their growing power. So I think we're going to see more of this. There are probably 3 or 4 different organizations, some more ad hoc than others, that China is setting up now. And it's going to be a challenge to thinkable, the conceivable Bretton Woods setup that we're all used to.
By and large, on all of these, though, do you believe that there's an understanding of just how profoundly unthinkable and therefore destabilizing and disrupting some of these could be? Not in 2 or 3 years, but maybe even 2 or 3 months. I mean, that's the kind of timescale we've been seeing.
I think that this understanding has not really totally reached us. And this I see from the way various countries are reacting. First of all, this investment bank idea is something that does not have a lot of specifics attached to it at the moment, as far as who will fund it, what timelines are, how it will be governed. But you see a lot of interest among states to be part of it, to buy in before you know what's in the bag, so to speak, the pig in the bag. You know, it's an Estonian expression.
Cat in the bag.
Cat in the bag. But then you would let the cat out of the bag. And this is a pig we're talking about.
It's a big,
Okay.
it's a big bag with a cat and a pig.
Something like that. Something like that. And then finally, I think the other big unthinkable, or the two unthinkables, the twin unthinkables in the EU that are not directly related to foreign policy but have mega foreign policy implications are a Grexit and a Brexit. A Grexit because then if things do not go as everybody hopes and Greece actually does leave the Eurozone, then there's a certain leverage also that is lost with regard to other foreign policy questions, such as Ukraine, such as Russia. With a Brexit, it would represent a huge credibility challenge.
But even if it's an unthinkable, presumably it's been scoped, you've worked out the different options. In other words, it's a contemplatable, maybe.
I think it depends on which capital you're asking, to be honest.
What I'm trying to do in this opening session is find out what else you should be thinking of, or we should be thinking of, which could hit us left field, right field, unexpectedly, but you're aware that something is possible.
Okay, scratch those. That's okay.
Okay. Finally, though, with the summit and the council meeting earlier this week, did you get a feeling that there was a real understanding of the potential now for this migration threat, not just to be a humanitarian issue, but a security issue across Europe, given the black flags beginning to fly in far more places, particularly in North Africa?
Yes.
Good.
Good.
In that case, Sandy. Sandy Vershbow, Deputy Secretary General of NATO. The threat from North Africa, but your assessment of unthinkables.
Good. Well, first of all, we do try to think ahead at NATO, even though we do get bogged down in the day-to-day, and we have a hell of a lot of decisions from our Wales summit to implement, and that is preoccupying us. But in the recent years, we've set up an expanded intelligence apparatus to do more analysis for the council and for the committees. And we now have a strategic analysis capability, it's called, the SAC, which is supposed to think outside the box, kind of marry intelligence with policy planning in different scenarios for how things could develop. So we're trying to be a little bit more engaged in anticipating the unexpected. And I think that that's going to become even more important because obviously the security environment we're going to be dealing with is, on the one hand, the most challenging probably in 50 years, both looking east and south, but more unpredictable as well. So first we have to think about the unpredictable, the inconceivable ways that the known problems could evolve, and we don't know how far a revisionist Russia is prepared to go, whether the Russian leadership is prepared to actually risk military conflict with NATO in some scenarios. Clearly, it's not about the Donbass. It's about Russian dominion over Ukraine and other former Soviet states, and maybe more in terms of rolling back. So we have to think about very scary scenarios that could come up on our net even this year or in the next couple of years.
Those are actually those are being detailed at this moment.
Well, we're thinking about it. As we develop our readiness action plan and how we deal with hybrid scenarios, we're thinking of some worst case scenarios and how we would respond. And in general, I want to say that we're trying to not just be reactive, not just analyzing the problems, but thinking about ways that NATO can use its toolkit, which is not just defense. It's also, we have all these partnership tools and defense capacity building. How can we improve the situation in our neighborhood and maybe head off some of these worst case scenarios by shaping the security environment more effectively? That's where, you know, how can we deal with ISIL? There's no big appetite for further large scale crisis response interventions by NATO, although we have to be ready for that. Just as in Libya, we didn't think we were going to do it, and 7 days later we were in. But we need, I think, to think of a much more proactive neighborhood strategy for the South. And this is something that inherently calls for cooperation among many organizations. That's why I'm wearing an EU tie today, to emphasize that. We need to think of all the ways to strengthen the resilience of those neighboring states across the Mediterranean and even further afield in terms of defense sector reform, helping train their armed forces, helping build up regional institutions like the African Union, Arab League, which is about to create some kind of military force, so that we can help our neighbors help themselves to head off the further expansion of ISIL, which is, you know, far more threatening in some ways, but far more pernicious than al-Qaeda because of this territorial ambition and the whole caliphate business. And then we have to think about, I mean, some of this also applies to the East, coming back to Ukraine. We need a much more effective and much more substantial Eastern neighborhood policy in NATO. We're doing some defense reform assistance and capacity building with Ukraine. We have a big package with Georgia. But the stakes have been raised by Putin in terms of seeking to reestablish control. And this question has been asked many times, is Europe, and that includes is NATO, prepared to compete much more aggressively to help preserve these countries' independence and sovereignty and their borders? Not by use of force, but by making them more resilient, more able to withstand that sort of pressure. And then we have to think about, you know, where we might have to intervene, whether it's in Libya, if there is a breakthrough in the diplomacy, or conversely, if there isn't. Both scenarios are pretty scary. What do we do if the Afghanistan situation, after we've finished our train and advise and assist mission and have moved to a much more limited partnership, if the situation deteriorates there or there's spreading conflict throughout Central and South Asia? Challenges to maritime security, freedom of navigation, as other rising powers could emerge that could call for a NATO response that right now we rely mainly on the United States, but will there be larger tasks in the maritime security area? So there's a lot of different things that we have to think about, even as we prepare to ensure that Article 5 is rock solid and that there's no doubt about that. And all of this takes resources, and that's why my new boss is going to be relentless in the face of every single allied leader when it comes to defense spending, defense investment, putting money on, in the right things that we need to do this full spectrum of tasks.
Are you able to reassure us, given what his predecessor, Rasmussen, said very clearly as he was leaving? He said, we missed a lot of clues as to what was happening with Russia and Ukraine, and therefore, he said it very publicly eventually. Are you now going to reassure us that actually NATO, after Newport, is now much more sensitized, has the capacity, whether in national pillars or whether across NATO, to actually identify some of these significant problems, if they are unthinkables, which happen that quickly, like with ISIL?
Mm-hmm. I think we're almost there. I mean, it's going to take a while. First, people are still trying to absorb the full ramifications of Ukraine, because it isn't over yet. So I think people are holding back on and are reserving judgment. But I think in terms of the real world threats that we have to ensure that we can defend against, these hybrid scenarios vis-a-vis the Eastern allies, continued pressure on Russia's neighbors, I think we're seized with that. I think the problems in the past were not that we weren't seeing the warning signs or even being told. I remember I went to Georgia in 2009, and Saakashvili, as my previous job, Saakashvili said, you know, watch out, Crimea is next. I didn't remember this actually until somebody said it was in WikiLeaks. But it all came back to me. But that's telling, that I didn't remember that, and but there he was, 6 years ago, telling us that's likely to be one of Putin's next objectives.
Was it your telegram that was in WikiLeaks?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, warning. Okay, so you did know. All right, thanks. And Brasseur, from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the President, what's your feeling about the unthinkables which are coming down the track? Do we know about them or not?
Well, if I look back why the Council of Europe has been founded in 1949 at the aftermath of World War II, our predecessors decided to set up an organization based on values, on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in order to prevent conflict. And I think that was a marvelous idea. And the Council of Europe well, there were 10 member countries, and then Turkey and Greece, they joined immediately. But then, of course, we increased in numbers, and now we have 47 member states. And after the fall of the Iron Curtain, all Eastern countries and Southeastern countries joined as well. And then the Council of Europe as a value-based organization was seen, well, do we still need it? Because by some it was seen as being the waiting room in order to enter the EU. And for some countries, of course, it was important, but some countries are never becoming a member of the EU, either because they don't want to, or like Norway or Switzerland. And so then they thought, well, everybody is now on the Convention on Human Rights and everything's fine, even a decade ago. So do we really need a value-based organization? And when I see what happens now, if I see, well, we are, of course, speaking about Ukraine and Russia, both members of our organization, but the situation of human rights in member states is really degrading. So I think that the organization is getting more important, and the advantage of the Council of Europe is we are not economy-based, security is excluded from our mandate, and we have no geopolitical interest. So in order to respond to the conflicts we are facing today, it should be the values. And if we had managed in the recent years to help countries to set up strong institutions, and we had that on the panel before, because Ukraine, well, there is the security issue, and they are facing a terrible crisis, but on the same time, they have to make reforms.
But what do you think is next in store for us? I mean, that's the core of this session. What are the things that you as president are thinking to yourself, we've really got to get out there? Things are changing, they're changing very fast, and we, as the Council of Europe, have to have an influence in this, or at least help in the sensing devices. We've just heard from Sandy Vershbow from NATO. I think he used the word scary twice. You know, things are moving very quickly.
Well, things are moving very quickly. So as politicians in our, we try and we have to react very quickly. But I think it is a threat that we don't have time anymore to sit down and to think. And to think also about the unthinkable, because we are driven by what's happening, the tragedies which happen, and then we need quick solutions, but that gives also food for populists. If I come back to the migration issue, which is really a problem, because that is also then a subject for populist movements in all our countries, and then we see an increase of hate, intolerance, and there the Council of Europe must play a role.
Do you see this as a dark shadow which is emerging about populism? Because there are many other reasons we could be discussing this as well.
Yes.
It may come up shortly.
That is really a very big danger, because hate and intolerance is a threat to our democratic systems. So what we need also is a platform to combat hate and intolerance, because we can see it everywhere. And mixed to the migration question, and I was, a fortnight ago, I went to Turkey, to the Syrian border, where they have the refugees. The efforts Turkey is doing is enormous, not only in the camps and spending up till now $5.5 billion, and we just contributed with $250 million, but also there is a refugee population in the camps, 250,000, but the others are in towns and